For 28 Christmases, the family of James Harris has carried the indescribable pain of not knowing who murdered their loved one. I'm happy to report that there will not be a 29th Christmas.
Every single morning, James Harris walked to his driveway gate in the dark, heading off to work to provide for the family he loved. He was a steady, gentle man who gave no one a reason to hurt him, yet someone he trusted enough to clock in next to every day stood waiting in those shadows to strike him down, strangle him, and strip his children of 28 holiday seasons with their father. For nearly 3 decades, that killer walked among us, breathing free air and living a normal life, believing he'd committed the perfect crime. He was wrong, because standing between him and total escape was a single, blood-soaked tissue left in the dirt, a silent witness that waited patiently in the dark until it could finally cry out for justice. Welcome back to Retrograde Crime, Retro Gang. Today we're unpacking a story of ultimate betrayal, a family's agonizing 29-year search for truth, and the microscopic piece of evidence that refused to let a murderer die with his secrets. It's 5 o'clock in the morning on December 22, 1994, and the rural sky over Chickamauga, Georgia is pitch black. Inside a quiet house at 1610 Boss Road, 54-year-old James Richard Harris is following the exact routine he keeps every single working day. He lives alone, works hard, and lives a steady, law-abiding life. He has never given a single person a reason to harbor hatred toward him. James grabs his things and walks down his long driveway toward the heavy metal entrance gate. He needs to open it, drive out, and make his morning commute across the state line to Miller Industries in Ooltewah, Tennessee, where he works as a production worker. It's a job that requires early hours, meaning he always leaves his house long before sunrise. That predictability, however, is precisely what makes him a target. Someone knows his schedule down to the minute. Someone knows that at 5 a.m., James will step out into the darkness alone, completely exposed at the narrow choke point of his own driveway gate. When James reaches the gate, the trap springs. An attacker ambushes him in the dark, striking him brutally across the back of the head. James fights back. Blood pools across the ground as a desperate struggle ensues. But the attacker overpowers him, wrapping a grip around his neck and strangling him until he stops breathing. Before slipping away into the black morning, the killer reaches into James's pockets, takes what little personal belongings he has on him, and leaves him lying motionless in the cold dirt. At 9 a.m., a neighbor walking past the Boss Road property notices James lying motionless at his entrance gate. The neighbor rushes over, realizes James is dead, and calls for help. Walker County Sheriff's deputies arrive quickly, assess the severe soft tissue trauma around James's neck, and immediately recognize this as a homicide. Realizing the gravity of the crime scene, they call in specialized backup, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Region 1 Field Office out of Calhoun. When GBI agents examine the scene, they find a site rich with physical evidence. James's jeans are heavily stained with blood. But right beside where his body lay, agents spot something else, a small bloody tissue paper resting in the dirt. Chemical testing reveals something critical right away. The blood on that tissue does not match James. The killer got cut during the struggle and left a piece of his own biological material behind. Most people assume that finding the killer's blood at the scene in the mid-90s would mean a case is practically solved on day one. But 1994 forensics were a completely different world compared to what we expect today. The standard method at the time, restriction fragment length polymorphism, or RFLP analysis, required massive, pristine biological samples to work. The degraded small blood sample on that tissue simply couldn't be processed by 1994 technology. The evidence was there, sitting right in front of them, but scientifically unreadable. Then came the issue of location. Boss Road was an isolated, semi-rural stretch with no foot traffic and no morning witnesses. No one saw a suspicious car, no one heard the struggle, and no one saw a figure fleeing into the dark. Standard protocol usually dictates canvassing the immediate neighborhood first, but when a victim lives in one state and works in another, where the investigation focuses its initial energy makes all the difference. The biggest flaw in the original investigation was jurisdictional. James lived in Walker County, Georgia, but he worked across the state border in Hamilton County, Tennessee. In 1994, without digital database sharing or cross-state task forces, That state line acted like a brick wall. Detectives spent weeks canvassing Chickamauga, knocking on doors along Boss Road, and interviewing neighbors who knew nothing. What they completely failed to do in those critical first weeks was cross into Tennessee to perform a full audit of Miller Industries. They never pulled employee time cards, and they never interviewed a single person James worked alongside every day. It's astonishing how a gap that simple can completely stall a murder investigation, allowing the one person who knew his schedule best to walk away unquestioned. Because of that oversight, the killer slipped entirely under the radar. By 1996, every local lead in Georgia had dried up. The physical evidence was packed away into an evidence locker, and the murder of James Harris went completely cold. His children were left to face decades of holidays without answers, while his killer seamlessly returned to work, right in plain sight. For nearly 11 years, the case file for James Harris sat inside a cold case box in Walker County, gathering dust while life moved on around it. His family endured decade after decade of empty holiday tables, forced to live with the agonizing reality that someone had taken James's life and simply walked away into the morning fog. In the world of cold cases, time is usually considered the ultimate enemy. Witnesses move away, memories fade, and physical evidence degrades in paper bags. But every so often, time is the exact thing an investigation needs, not because human memory improves, but because the technology sitting inside forensic laboratories evolves. By 2005, a major shift was underway within law enforcement. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Region 1 Field Office initiated a systematic, comprehensive review of unsolved homicides across Walker County. The goal wasn't to re-interview the same neighbors or reread the same dead-end police reports from 1994. The goal was to look at the physical evidence room with entirely new eyes. When investigators pulled the Harris file, they went straight to the evidence locker. Sitting inside were the original blood-stained jeans James had been wearing on the morning he was killed, along with the single, blood-soaked tissue paper recovered from the dirt right beside his body. Back in 1994, those items were scientifically unreadable. The older RFLP testing method required large, pristine, undegraded samples that crime scene technology back then just couldn't extract from a tiny, dirty tissue. But 11 years later, forensic science had taken a massive leap forward. Investigators resubmitted the genes and the tissue paper to the GBI crime lab for a completely different type of analysis. Short tandem repeat, or STR DNA testing. Unlike the outdated techniques of the mid-90s, STR testing was exponentially more sensitive. It required only microscopic biological samples, a fraction of a drop of blood or a cluster of skin cells, to build an individual genetic profile. When forensic analysts at the GBI lab processed the bloody tissue and the stains on James's genes, the results were definitive. They didn't just find a degraded mix, they successfully isolated a single-source male DNA profile. It was clean, unmistakable, and undeniably belonged to the man who fought James at his driveway gate. It's mind-boggling how a tiny piece of discarded trash, sitting in a dark cardboard box for over a decade, can retain someone's exact biological signature perfectly preserved against time. For the first time since December 22, 1994, investigators were no longer chasing a ghost. They held the killer's exact genetic fingerprint right in their hands. Naturally, this is the exact moment in any investigation where you expect the handcuffs to come out. Having a full, single-source male DNA profile in a murder case seems like game over. Grounded in that confidence, GBI scientists immediately uploaded the freshly isolated profile into regional and national DNA databases. They also ran direct comparisons against reference samples that had been voluntarily collected from early persons of interest back in the mid-1990s. One by one, the results came back. System match, negative. Person of interest comparison, negative. Every single lead checked against the newly minted DNA profile failed to produce a hit. It created a strange, deeply frustrating paradox for the investigative team. On paper, they had achieved the ultimate scientific breakthrough. They knew the precise genetic identity of the man who strangled James Harris. Yet, without a matching record in the database or a suspect to compare it against, that genetic profile was completely useless. The tissue paper had finally spoken, but it hadn't given them a name. It highlights a major flaw in how most people view forensic science. A DNA profile isn't a search engine that magically displays a picture and an address. It's just a key waiting for the right lock. The investigation found itself stuck on a cruel new plateau. The science had done its job and caught up to 1994, but without traditional police work connecting that profile to a real living person, the case was destined to go cold all over again. Detectives were left holding the killer's DNA, knowing he was out there somewhere, likely living a normal life, completely oblivious to the fact that his biological code was sitting in a state lab file, waiting for one single break to tie it to his face. By 2009, 4 years had passed since the GBI isolated the killer's DNA profile, and the case remained strictly at a standstill. The biological key was sitting in a state database, but detectives still didn't have a lock to put it in. That dead silence finally broke not through a high-tech lab test, but through an anonymous phone call. A tip was phoned into Crime Stoppers. The caller didn't give a full name, a home address, or a detailed breakdown of the night James Harris died. They dropped just one single word before hanging up: Alan. On its own, a single first name from an anonymous caller is practically useless in a typical homicide investigation. It's the kind of vague, single-word lead that usually gets buried under a stack of higher-priority paperwork. But for detectives who had been holding on to an unmatched genetic profile for 4 long years, even a single word was worth tearing open old files for. Walker County Sheriff's detectives and GBI agents decided to return to the one area of James's life that the original 1994 investigation had completely overlooked: his workplace. Investigators reached across the state line into Ooltewah, Tennessee, contacting the management at Miller Industries. They requested access to the factory's historical personnel and payroll records from December 1994. Detectives began manually auditing every single employee name on those 15-year-old rosters, searching specifically for anyone matching the tip line name. That cross-referencing process brought them face-to-face with a name that had never once appeared in the original case files: Robert Alan Mowry. Mowry had been a young co-worker of James's at the plant, working the exact same shifts. Because of the jurisdictional boundary line that split the investigation back in 1994, he was never interviewed, never questioned, and never even flagged as a potential witness. When detectives pulled Mowry's actual time card records from the morning of December 22, 1994, everything shifted. On the exact morning James Harris was ambushed and killed at his gate miles away, Robert Alan Mowry had clocked into work late. It wasn't an authorized absence or a pre-approved shift swap. It was an unexcused, uncharacteristic late arrival, occurring during the exact time window of the murder. It is incredible how a single forgotten time card from 1994, sitting in a dusty HR filing cabinet across state lines, can suddenly blow a cold case wide open 15 years later. For the first time since 1994, detectives had a name, a direct connection to the victim, and a broken workplace timeline on the morning of the murder. The puzzle pieces were finally starting to align. They had the killer's isolated DNA profile from 2005 sitting in a lab file, and now they had a primary suspect whose schedule placed him near the scene. Yet, this is precisely where the investigation slammed into a massive, frustrating legal brick wall. To confirm whether Robert Alan Mowry was the killer, police needed one simple thing: a direct sample of his DNA to compare against the bloody tissue from the crime scene. But under the law, you cannot simply force a citizen to roll up their sleeve or hand over a swab because of an anonymous single-name tip and a 15-year-old late time card. A partial name and an unexcused late arrival at work do not meet the legal threshold of probable cause. Without probable cause, a judge cannot sign a search warrant for a biological sample, and without a warrant, detectives couldn't legally demand a single drop of Mowry's blood or saliva. It is mind-boggling to realize that police can literally be staring at the person they strongly suspect committed a murder, holding the killer's exact DNA in a lab, and still be completely powerless to force a test. Mowry wasn't hiding in the woods or living under an alias. He had moved on with his life, living completely normally in Tennessee, while detectives watched from across the state line. Every legal door to get his DNA directly was slammed shut. The case entered a strange, agonizing holding pattern. The GBI knew who they wanted, but without the legal grounds to get his genetic material, The entire investigation was locked in a standstill that would last for years. For over a decade after the 2009 tip line call, the investigation into James Harris's murder hung in a delicate balance. Detectives knew who they were looking at, but knowing wasn't the same as proving. Robert Alan Mowry continued living his life across Tennessee, completely unaware that his name was permanently etched at the top of a cold case board. By 2020, 26 years had passed since the morning James was ambushed at his driveway gate. The initial investigators had retired, but the drive to close the case never faded. Recognizing that traditional search warrants were out of reach, law enforcement shifted tactics entirely. They formed a multi-agency task force that bridged state lines, bringing together 7 different agencies, including the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the Walker County Sheriff's Office, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and local Tennessee police departments. The goal of this massive multi-agency operation was singular and razor-sharp: execute covert physical surveillance on Mowry and recover a usable biological sample without his knowledge. Because police couldn't legally demand a DNA swab, they had to rely on a settled legal precedent. Once a person discards an item in public, they abandon their privacy rights to it. If Mowry dropped a cigarette butt, threw away a fast food cup, or discarded a water bottle, that trash became fair game for law enforcement. Surveillance teams quietly tracked Mowry's movements as he went about his daily routine in Tennessee. Every move he made was watched, waiting for the exact moment he would leave behind a piece of his own biological footprint. It's crazy to think about how a person can go about an entirely mundane day, grabbing a coffee or running an errand, completely oblivious to the fact that half a dozen undercover agents are patiently waiting for them to throw something in the trash. The task force's patience paid off. Undercover officers successfully recovered a discarded item carrying Mowry's genetic material, bagged it as physical evidence, and immediately rushed it under strict chain of custody straight to the GBI crime lab. Inside the laboratory, forensic scientists pulled the covertly collected sample and prepared to compare it against the single-source male DNA profile extracted back in 2005, the profile that had been waiting inside an evidence locker since 1994, taken directly from James's genes and that dropped bloody tissue. This was the moment of absolute truth. After 26 years of scientific evolution, legal roadblocks and silent surveillance, there was no longer any room for error. The forensic analysis yielded a direct, undeniable nuclear DNA match. The biological footprint left in the dirt on Boss Road in 1994 belonged to Robert Alan Mowry. The tissue he discarded at the crime scene decades earlier had finally matched the trash he discarded 26 years later. It is incredible how a killer can build an entire life, believe the past is buried forever, and still be brought down by the exact same careless mistake twice in one lifetime. With an irrefutable STR DNA match finally in hand, the legal threshold was shattered. Warrants were instantly drawn up, and the trap closed. On September 4, 2020, at approximately 10 p.m., special agents with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation located Mowry in Nashville. He was 50 years old, more than double the age he was when he clocked into Miller Industries late on December 22, 1994. When agents moved in and placed him under arrest, Mowry's 26 years of freedom instantly came to an end. He was taken into custody without incident, bringing a quarter-century of silence to a sudden, dramatic close. For the Harris family, the arrest marked the end of an agonizing 28-year wait for a name. But as Mowry was booked into a cell, the focus immediately shifted from the streets to the courtroom. Gathering DNA in secret is one thing, but presenting it to 12 jurors in a court of law is where a case is truly won or lost. Following his arrest in Nashville, Robert Alan Mowry was extradited across state lines back to Georgia to face justice in the jurisdiction where James Harris's life was taken. The state moved decisively. A grand jury in the Lookout Mountain Judicial Circuit formally indicted Mowry in Walker County Superior Court under case number 22-CR-025. The indictment handed down 4 serious felony counts: malice murder, felony murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. Pretrial proceedings, calendar calls, and defense motions dragged on through November of 2022. For the Harris family, watching the legal system move at a crawl was another test of endurance, adding to the nearly 3 decades they had already spent waiting for closure. By late November 2023, the case finally reached a packed courtroom for trial. Standing before the court, Mowry maintained a plea of not guilty, forcing prosecutors Deanna Reisman and Alan Smith to prove every single element of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. Over 7 intense trial days, the prosecution constructed a meticulous, brick-by-brick case built on physical science and decades-old paper trails. They called GBI Crime Lab forensic scientists to the stand, who took the jury step-by-step through the STR DNA testing process. The experts explained how the genetic material recovered from the bloody tissue in 1994 and James's genes matched the covertly collected sample pulled from Mowry in 2020. It's remarkable how a defense can try to argue innocence when faced with a direct nuclear DNA match extracted from a victim's clothing and the exact spot where a struggle occurred. To anchor the science to a real-world timeline, prosecutors brought in historical employment records from Miller Industries. They presented Mowry's time cards from December 22, 1994, highlighting his unexcused late arrival on the exact morning of the ambush. Former co-workers took the stand to establish how closely Mowry and James worked together, proving Mowry knew James's early morning schedule inside and out. Neighbors from Boss Road testified about the quiet, predictable nature of the neighborhood and the dark morning James was found. Law enforcement officers from both Georgia and Tennessee detailed the complex cross-border journey, from the initial 1994 cold case freeze, to the 2009 Crime Stoppers tip, to the 2020 undercover surveillance operation. The defense team, led by attorney Martin J. Levitt, worked to cast doubt on the state's long timeline and the physical evidence. But picking apart a single-source male DNA match left behind at a private driveway gate proved to be an almost impossible hurdle. It leads to a glaring question that every jury has to weigh. When science places a suspect's blood directly at a private crime scene, how much room is really left for reasonable doubt? On Wednesday, December 6, 2023, after 7 days of testimony and careful deliberation, the Walker County jury returned to the courtroom with their verdict: guilty of felony murder. The presiding judge did not hesitate or delay sentencing. Right there in the courtroom, Robert Alan Mowry was sentenced immediately to life imprisonment in the custody of the Georgia Department of Corrections. 29 years after James Harris walked down his driveway into the morning dark, the man who ambushed him was finally led away in handcuffs to spend the rest of his life behind bars. The long road to justice was officially complete, leaving a courtroom silent after nearly 30 years of waiting. The conviction of Robert Alan Mowry wasn't just the end of a trial. It was a profound, long-awaited moment of closure for a family that had spent 28 holiday seasons sitting around an empty chair. For nearly 3 decades, the Harris family carried the crushing weight of unanswered questions, watching years turn into decades while the person who took James's life lived freely just miles down the road. When the verdict was read in that Walker County courtroom, it finally provided the answer they had been denied for almost half a lifetime. Beyond the personal justice for James Harris, this case stands out as a powerful study in how America's oldest cold cases actually get solved. In an era where modern true crime coverage is dominated by investigative genetic genealogy and massive family tree databases, people often assume that's the only way a decades-old murder can be cracked today. The resolution of the Harris case proved something entirely different. This case wasn't solved by uploading DNA to public genealogy websites or tracking down distant third cousins. It was solved through a seamless blend of meticulous physical evidence preservation, advanced STR DNA technology, old-fashioned tip-line leads, and gritty time card auditing. It shows that when evidence is properly collected and preserved, it acts as a ticking clock waiting for science to catch up. It's remarkable to think about how many evidence lockers across the country hold a single discarded item that could instantly solve a decades-old mystery if someone simply went back to look. If this story shows you how powerful a single forgotten piece of evidence can be when science finally catches up, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to Retrograde Crime, and join the Retro Gang so you never miss another deep dive into the cases that refuse to stay cold.